Sir. Sir, I need you to acknowledge me right now.
Sir.
Sir, I need you to ignore me right now. He can deaf. He has shown you his documentation twice. You refused to look at both times.
Pilot targets deaf black man. What this 11-year-old billionaire girl did next left the cabin speechless. Sir. Sir, I need you to acknowledge me right now. Nothing. Sir, this is your final warning. If you do not respond to me immediately, I will have this aircraft diverted and you will be removed by law enforcement. Still nothing. Then a voice. Almost unbothered, like someone reading from a grocery list. He can't hear you. The pause. A long one. He is deaf. He has shown you his documentation twice. You have refused to look at it both times. And I need you to understand something very clearly before this plane moves another inch. I have been recording since the moment you walked out of that cockpit. So has he. Every word you've said, every word you haven't said, and every document you chose not to read, all of it is on video. And when this lands, you are going to wish, deeply and sincerely, that you had turned around and gone back to your seat. Silence. Not the polite kind. The kind that fills a pressurized cabin when 40-something adults suddenly realize that the calmest, most dangerous person on the entire plane is 11 years old. And then, the sound of a phone camera clicking on. Then another. Then another. That is where this story begins. 37,000 feet in the air, somewhere over the American South, on a Tuesday morning that started as the most ordinary day of Marcus Webb's professional life, and ended as the most watched 4 minutes and 17 seconds on the internet that week. Stay with me, because this story is not just about what happened on that plane. It is about everything that made that moment possible, everything that came after it, and the quiet, devastating truth that sits at the center of it all. What you are about to hear is the story of a first-class cabin at cruising altitude, a 52-year-old airline captain with 28 years of flying and one catastrophic blind spot, and a deaf black aerospace engineer who had done everything right, every single thing, and was still being told, without a single word of justification, that he did not belong in his seat. But Captain Daniel Forsyth had absolutely no idea, not the faintest, most distant idea, that the 11-year-old girl sitting 2 seats away from his target was Zura Adekunle Whitfield. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her face. He didn't know that her family's aviation logistics company held ground handling contracts worth millions of dollars with the very airline whose uniform he was wearing. He didn't know that she had been reading a legal brief for the past 40 minutes. And he did not know that her phone had been recording from the second he stepped out of that cockpit with his decision already made. You saw how it started. Now we are going to tell you the full story, who Marcus Webb really is, what he was carrying, why he had learned to document everything before anyone even asked, and what happened the moment the airline's regional VP of operations boarded that plane and looked at the documents a captain had refused to see. If stories like this matter to you, stories about dignity, about accountability, about the kind of justice that doesn't ask permission, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is where those stories live. Marcus Webb was born in Atlanta, Georgia, 44 years ago, into a family that understood service before it understood comfort. His grandfather served in Korea. His father served 2 tours in Vietnam and came home quieter than he left. His mother worked 31 years as a registered nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital, the kind of woman who packed her own lunch and never took a sick day because the patients needed her more than she needed a rest. Marcus grew up understanding that the world did not hand you anything. You built it. You documented it. You showed your work. He was 19 years old the first time he sat in the left seat of a Cessna 172 as a trainee pilot and felt, for the first and most complete time in his young life, that the sky was not a ceiling, it was a floor. There was something about the altitude, about the physics of lift and thrust working exactly as the textbooks said they would, that made Marcus Webb feel like a man who understood the world and was understood by it in return. 2 weeks later, he was in the hospital. Bacterial meningitis. The kind that moves fast and decides things for you before you have a chance to weigh in. It took his hearing, not all at once, but in a cascade of diminishing sound that lasted 11 days and ended in a silence so complete and so permanent that Marcus, lying in that hospital bed at 19, had to grieve a version of himself he had barely met. He could no longer be a commercial pilot. The certification requirements were unambiguous. The sky he had just discovered, the one that felt like it belonged to him, had just closed one of its doors. So Marcus Webb did what the men and women in his family had always done when something was taken from them. He found another door. He enrolled at Georgia Tech Aerospace Engineering. He graduated 4th in his class. He then spent the next 2 decades becoming one of the most respected atmospheric systems engineers in the country, a man whose understanding of how aircraft behave at altitude was, by most accounts, more comprehensive than the majority of the people paid to fly them. He was one of 12 engineers who contributed to a NASA atmospheric drone project that, to this day, is cited in FAA research on high-altitude surveillance systems. He consulted for 3 of the top 5 commercial aircraft manufacturers in the world. He had been invited to keynote at international aerospace conferences in London, Singapore, and Cape Town. And on this particular Tuesday morning, he was connecting through Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport on his way to Los Angeles, where he had been invited, for the first time as the headline speaker, not a panelist, not a workshop leader, not a supporting voice, but the name on the marquee, to deliver the keynote address at the National Aerospace Innovation Summit. He communicates through a combination of lip reading, a notes application on his phone that he types into and turns to face whoever he is speaking with, and American Sign Language for those who know it. He wears a small hearing aid that helps him sense vibration and low-frequency sound, but it does not restore speech comprehension. He has used these methods for 25 years. He is fluent in them the way a painter is fluent in brushwork, not because he has to be, but because they are simply how he moves through the world. In his carry-on that morning was a titanium briefcase. Inside that briefcase was a working prototype component for a next-generation atmospheric drone system, a piece of hardware worth $340,000, insured, documented, pre-cleared by the Transportation Security Administration, and accompanied by a NASA authorization letter, a manufacturer's certificate of authenticity, a TSA pre-approval form, and Marcus's own company insurance documentation. Every paper was in a labeled folder. Every folder was in order. Because Marcus Webb had learned, the way a lot of black professionals in America learn things, not from a classroom but from experience, that being prepared before anyone asks is not the same as being paranoid. It is survival. He had flown this exact airline more than 200 times. He held Platinum Elite status, the highest tier the airline offered. He had accumulated so many miles that the airline sent him a physical card embossed with his name and a toll-free number that connected directly to a dedicated concierge line. He knew the boarding procedures. He knew the overhead bin dimensions. He knew which flight attendants on the Atlanta-LA route were kind and which ones were efficient and which ones were both. And he had one habit that his colleagues teased him about and that he had never once abandoned. Every time he boarded a new flight, he took out his phone and recorded the first 60 seconds. A simple, quiet, unobtrusive video. His seat. His case in the overhead bin. The aisle. The cabin. 60 seconds. Then he put the phone away. He had started doing it after an incident 3 years prior, when a gate agent insisted his carry-on had not been approved for overhead storage despite his documentation clearly showing it had. He had no recording. He had no recourse. The phone video cost him nothing and had, until this morning, never been necessary. Until this morning, it had been the kind of precaution you keep hoping you'll never need. It was a Tuesday in November. Atlanta was doing what Atlanta does in November. Warm enough to make you question your coat, cool enough to make you regret not wearing it. The morning light at Hartsfield-Jackson had that particular quality of early winter sun, flat and pale and honest. The kind that doesn't flatter anything but makes everything perfectly clear. Marcus had arrived at the gate with 45 minutes to spare. He always did. He had coffee, black, no sugar, in a travel mug his niece had given him for his birthday, the one with the Georgia Tech logo that had started to fade from too many washes. He sat near the window and reviewed his keynote slides on his laptop, making small adjustments to the third section, the part about atmospheric data modeling that he always worried ran a minute too long. He boarded with the first group. Platinum Elite. He nodded to the gate agent, scanned his pass, walked the jetway with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who has done this 200 times and feels no urgency about it. He found seat 2A. Window. Left side. His preferred seat on every flight. The view on approach into LAX over the Pacific was something he had never gotten tired of, even after all these years of staring at flight paths on a screen. He lifted the titanium case into the overhead bin carefully. Methodically. He took his phone out and recorded his 60 seconds, the bin, the seat, the aisle, the quiet cabin, and then he put the phone in his breast pocket. He settled in. Opened his laptop. Put on his noise-canceling headphones, not to hear anything, but because the vibration reduction made long flights less physically uncomfortable. To anyone watching, he was simply a man in first class doing what people in first class do, which is nothing in particular, at their own pace, without explanation. The cabin filled slowly. A businessman in seat 1A. A couple in 3A and 3B. A man in 4A with a guitar case. Full-sized, not a travel guitar, the kind that takes up the entire overhead bin, who the flight attendant helped with practiced efficiency and a warm smile. Seat 2B remained empty. And then seat 2C. The aisle seat. A backpack landed in it first, matte black, structured, the kind sold at a boutique in Soho that doesn't put its price on the tag because if you need to ask, you already know. Then the person wearing it. Well, a child. She couldn't have been more than 4 feet 9 inches tall. She had the careful, arranged composure of someone who had spent considerable time in rooms where adults expected her to be quieter than she felt like being. She sat down without looking around. Pulled the backpack onto her lap. Unzipped the front pocket and removed, not a tablet, not headphones, not a snack, a legal brief. Printed, stapled, annotated in 2 colors of ink. She opened it to a page near the middle and began reading. Marcus didn't notice her. He was in his slides. The flight attendant, Sandra, according to her name tag, a woman in her late 40s with the specific kind of warmth that comes from genuinely liking her job, came through and checked on first class. She brought Marcus a glass of water without being asked. He nodded his thanks. She smiled. The gate door was about to close. The cabin was at capacity. Outside the small oval window, the tarmac shimmered faintly with jet exhaust, and Atlanta stretched away from them in all directions, ordinary and enormous and completely unaware that this particular Tuesday was about to mean something. And then the cockpit door opened. If you've made it this far and you feel that pull in your chest, that combination of dread and recognition that comes from knowing exactly where this is headed, then you already know this channel is for you. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Because every week, we tell the stories that don't get told loudly enough, and we don't stop until the whole truth is on the table. Have you ever been in a situation where you had every document, every proof, every receipt, and still had to fight to be believed? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. Captain Daniel Forsyth had been flying commercial aircraft for 28 years. He had a total of over 19,000 logged hours. He had been through 2 engine failures, 1 emergency landing in a crosswind that made regional news, and a decompression event at altitude that he handled so cleanly his first officer didn't realize the severity until they were already descending. By every measurable technical metric, Daniel Forsyth was an exceptional pilot. He was a 52-year-old white man from a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina, who had grown up in a house where the word distinguished was used to describe people who looked like him, and words he never quite examined were used, quietly, to describe people who didn't. He was not an overtly cruel man. He did not think of himself as someone who held prejudice. He thought of himself as someone with instincts, sharp, professional instincts honed by 3 decades in the air. He trusted those instincts the way some men trust their gut over a map, even when the map is correct and the gut is simply familiar with a smaller world. When he stepped out of the cockpit that morning and scanned first class, his eyes did not travel the cabin with curiosity. They traveled with a decision that had already been made, looking for the evidence to confirm it. They landed on seat 2A. Marcus Webb. Sitting quietly. Reading. Headphones on. Titanium briefcase in the overhead bin above him. Forsyth said something to Sandra, the lead flight attendant. She said something back, something that, from the expressions visible to those watching, appeared to be a quiet attempt at redirection. Her body language was the body language of someone who does not agree with what is being asked of them but also understands that argument costs something she is not sure she can afford right now. Forsyth's body language was the body language of a man who has already decided and is moving forward. He walked down the aisle. In seat 2C, the girl with the legal brief looked up. She watched Forsyth cover the 12 feet between the cockpit door and seat 2A with the certainty of someone who has never had to question whether their arrival in a room would be welcomed. She watched him and something in her expression shifted, not to alarm and not to surprise. To recognition. The specific recognition of a person who has seen this particular shape of arrogance before, even at 11 years old, and knows immediately what it is capable of. She marked her page. She did not put the brief away. Forsyth tapped Marcus on the shoulder. Marcus removed his headphones and looked up with the pleasant, open expression of a man who assumes, by default, that an interruption is probably benign. He smiled slightly. He waited. Forsyth did not smile back. He said there had been concerns flagged at the gate. About Marcus's carry-on item. The large one in the bin. Marcus reached for his phone, the Notes app already open from habit, and typed. The case contains an approved aerospace prototype component. I have full documentation including TSA pre-clearance. Would you like to see it? He turned the phone toward Forsyth. Forsyth did not look at the phone. He said the item needed to be checked. It couldn't stay in the overhead bin. Marcus typed. It cannot be checked. It contains a fragile precision instrument worth $340,000. It is fully insured for cabin carry. I have the documentation here. Forsyth said he understood Marcus had documents, but that as captain he had final authority over what was stored in the cabin, and his assessment was that the item needed to go below. Marcus typed one question. A simple one. He pointed toward the overhead bin on the opposite side of the aisle, the one containing the full-sized guitar case belonging to the man in seat 3A, and he typed, "Is the same policy being applied to that item?" Forsyth's jaw shifted. He said that was a different situation. Marcus typed, "How?" Forsyth did not answer. He said Marcus needed to comply or they would have a problem. And here is the part that people who watched the video kept returning to. Marcus Webb, a man who had lost his voice twice, once to meningitis at 19, and once to every professional encounter that had quietly told him his voice didn't carry sufficient weight in a room, did not raise what was left of it. He sat in his seat. He looked at the captain. He was completely, utterly still. The kind of still that is not passivity and is not defeat. The kind of still that is a person who has prepared for exactly this moment and is choosing, deliberately, how to spend it. He opened the titanium briefcase. Just slightly. Just enough to reveal the interior, the labeled folders, the NASA letterhead visible on top, the systematic organization of every document he had known, from the moment he packed it, that he might need to produce in a situation exactly like this one. He held it so Forsyth could see it clearly. Forsyth looked at it for 1 second. And then he looked away. Sandra appeared. She had the look of a woman in an impossible position, which is exactly the position she was in. She told Marcus, gently, carefully, the way people deliver things they don't believe, that the captain had authority over the cabin and she was sorry, but Marcus would need to comply with his request. Marcus typed and showed her, "Has anyone looked at the documentation?" Sandra looked at it. She could see the NASA letterhead. She could see the TSA pre-approval stamp. She looked at Forsyth. Forsyth did not look at the documents. Then the girl in 2C spoke for the first time. She did not raise her voice. She did not lean forward dramatically. She simply closed the legal brief, turned toward the aisle, and said, in the tone of someone who is in the habit of being precise, "He can't speak to you verbally. He is deaf. He has shown you his documentation twice and you have not looked at it either time. Would you like to explain what specific regulation or policy he is currently in violation of?" Forsyth looked at her. Really looked at her, probably for the first time. A small child in seat 2C with a legal brief and a backpack and an expression that contained no fear whatsoever. He gave her the look. Most adults know the look. The one that says, "You are a child, this is not your concern, be quiet." It is delivered without words because it doesn't need them, It has been working on children for generations. It is calibrated to remind them of their place. The girl held his gaze. She did not move. After 3 full seconds, which is a long time when no one is breathing, Forsyth turned back to Marcus. He said, "Sir, I'm not going to debate this with someone who won't even speak to me." The cabin, which had been quietly pretending not to watch, went slightly more still. Marcus typed and turned the phone to face Forsyth one final time. "I am speaking to you. You are not reading what I am saying. That is not the same as my silence." Forsyth unclipped the radio from his belt. He said if Marcus would not comply, he would have him removed before departure and have the item inspected on the tarmac by airline security. He said he was doing this in the interest of passenger safety. He used the word safety 3 times in 4 sentences. He called the gate. Whatever he said to the gate agent, it was said in a tone of complete authority, the tone of a man who has been the final word in every room he has occupied for 28 years and has no reason to believe this room will be any different. His voice, when it performs certainty, is very convincing. Marcus did not move. He knew, with the particular, exhausting knowledge of a black man in America who has been in rooms where the rules bend without warning, exactly what was available to him in this moment and what was not. He knew that agitation would be used against him. He knew that volume would be used against him. He knew that standing up too quickly, or gesturing too broadly, or allowing the natural, reasonable anger building in his chest to reach his face, would become evidence in a story that was already being written without his input. He had lived in this knowledge for 44 years. It did not make it less heavy. It just made it familiar. He reached into his breast pocket. He took out his phone. He opened the camera. And quietly, without announcing it, without pointing it at Forsyth's face, without performing anything for anyone, he set it on the armrest facing the aisle and pressed record. In seat 2C, the girl had been recording since Forsyth walked out of the cockpit. Her phone, the newest model, matte black, no case, held at a slight downward angle, had captured every moment from Forsyth's first approach. Every document shown. Every document ignored. Every exchange, typed and spoken, between a man trying to exercise institutional power and another man responding with nothing but evidence and calm. She had not said a word about it. She had not announced it. She had simply been doing it from the beginning because she had learned from a father who built a logistics empire from a one-truck operation in Lagos before he moved his family to London and then to New York, that the people who have power in rooms are the ones who document what happens in them. She was 11 years old and she understood this with a completeness that most people spend decades trying to acquire. Other passengers in first class were watching now. Not all of them were watching sympathetically. The man in seat 4A, the one who had nodded his head earlier at Marcus, had settled back in his seat with the studied neutrality of someone who has decided that whatever is happening is probably justified, because things that happen at altitude generally are. The couple in 3A and 3B were looking at their phones with the particular focus of people who are not looking at their phones. Would the police believe Marcus? Would anyone on that plane, if it came to that, stand up and say what they had clearly witnessed? The question hung in the recycled cabin air the way questions like that always do, heavy, unanswered, uncomfortable. 2 gate agents boarded within 4 minutes. They moved through the main cabin with the practiced efficiency of people who respond to radio calls like this regularly and have been trained to de-escalate first and ask questions second. They reached first class. They looked at Forsyth. They looked at Marcus. They looked at the titanium case in the overhead bin. One of them asked Marcus politely to accompany them off the plane. Marcus typed and showed the screen. "What specific regulation have I violated that requires my removal?" The gate agent said the captain had requested his removal. Marcus typed, "That is not a regulation." He did not move. He was not aggressive. He had not raised his voice, the one he rarely used. He had not made a sudden movement. He was a man sitting in a first-class seat he had paid for, in a row above his name on a manifest, with his documentation open in his lap, asking a simple question and waiting for a simple answer. The question did not receive an answer. Forsyth stepped forward. He reached up toward the overhead bin. And Marcus stood. Not quickly. Not aggressively. He simply rose from his seat to his full height, which was considerable, and placed himself between the captain and the bin, and he spoke. He didn't type it. He said it, the way deaf people who once had hearing sometimes speak when something rises above the threshold of what a screen and a keyboard can carry. It wasn't perfectly enunciated. It carried the particular texture of a voice that has had no acoustic feedback for 25 years, that exists in its speaker the way something exists when you can feel it but not hear it. But it was completely, unmistakably clear. Please, don't touch my property. 5 words. Every one of them landed. The cabin was motionless. And then the girl in seat 2C stood up. She was 4 feet 9 inches tall and 11 years old, and she stepped into the aisle, and she was the smallest person standing and somehow occupied more of the room than any of them, and she looked at the gate agents, not at Forsyth, not at Marcus, specifically at the gate agents, and she said, with the deliberate calm of someone who has rehearsed nothing but is nevertheless prepared for everything. I would like you to note, for the record, that this man has produced documentation twice, has violated no policy that has been named, and is being asked to leave a seat he paid for in full, on a flight he boards as a Platinum Elite member, on a plane that my family's company services under a ground handling contract. I would also like you to know who I am. She reached into the front pocket of her backpack and produced a card. A small, cream-colored, embossed card. She held it out to the nearest gate agent. He took it. The gate agent read the card. He read it once. Then he read it again. He looked at his colleague. His colleague looked at the card. His colleague's posture, visibly, physically, changed. Not dramatically. Just the small, involuntary recalibration that happens in a person's spine when they realize the room they are in is not the room they thought they were in. The first agent stepped away from the group. He keyed his radio. His voice, when he spoke into it, was quiet and fast and had lost the professional detachment he'd carried onto the plane. He was describing the situation to someone in a way that made it clear this was being escalated above his authority immediately. Forsyth had not seen the card. He was still talking about protocol, about safety considerations, about his 28 years of authority in this uniform, about the precedent being set if a captain's decision was being challenged at the gate by a passenger. He was delivering these points with the confidence of a man who believes his title is his argument. He had not yet noticed that the 2 gate agents were no longer listening to him. He had not yet noticed that the cabin around him had reached the particular quality of silence that gathers when a room understands something its loudest occupant does not. Marcus watched the girl from seat 2A. He was still standing. His hand was still between the captain and the overhead bin. But something had entered his expression, not relief, not yet, because you do not feel relief when the situation is still unresolved and your property is still at risk and a man in a uniform is still claiming authority over your life. But there was something. The faint, strange sensation of being witnessed. Not just recorded, not just watched, but genuinely seen by another person who understood the geometry of what was happening and had chosen, without hesitation, which side of it to stand on. The girl stood in the aisle with her backpack and her legal brief and her recording phone, and she did not look at Marcus the way people look at a victim. She looked at him the way one professional looks at another, with a nod that said, "I see the situation clearly, I have intervened appropriately, let's see what happens next." The first gate agent returned from the back of the jetway. The airline's regional VP of airport operations was already in the terminal. She was on her way to the aircraft. The flight was not departing yet. We are 20 minutes into this story and a captain has still not looked at a single document. A child is standing in a first-class aisle holding a card that just changed the entire equation. And the most important person in this story hasn't even arrived yet. If you want to see what accountability looks like when it actually shows up, subscribe now and don't you dare touch that skip button. The reckoning is 3 minutes away. Engagement question number 2. At what point in this story did you feel the most frustrated, and why? Drop your timestamp in the comments. Let's talk about it. Diane Okafor had been the regional vice president of airport operations for the airline's Atlanta hub for 6 years. Before that, she had spent 4 years as a compliance officer. Before that, she was a gate supervisor who had been promoted 3 times in 30 months because she had a rare and specific gift. When something was going wrong in a system, she could see it, not just its surface, not just its symptoms, but the structural fault underneath it, the place where the wrong assumption had been allowed to harden into policy. She was also a Nigerian-American woman in her mid-40s who had spent her entire career in the aviation industry and understood, from her own history in it, exactly what kinds of assumptions lived in rooms like this one. She boarded the aircraft 4 minutes after the radio call. 4 minutes is fast enough to tell you the call was not routine. 4 minutes is a woman who was already in the terminal, heard the transmission, and moved immediately, not because she was instructed to, but because she understood what the description of the situation meant, and she was not willing to let it develop any further on her watch. She was composed in the way that senior executives are composed when they are deeply, professionally angry, which is to say that her expression gave away nothing while her efficiency gave away everything. She walked to first class. She looked at Marcus. She looked at Forsyth. She looked at the girl standing in the aisle. She looked at the card that the gate agent was holding. She asked to see Marcus's documentation. Marcus handed her the folder. Of it. The NASA clearance letter on official letterhead with the program director's signature. The TSA pre-approval form stamped and signed and dated. The manufacturer's certificate of authenticity for the prototype component. The insurance documentation from his company's carrier, showing the item was cleared for cabin carry. His Platinum Elite card. His keynote invitation letter from the National Aerospace Innovation Summit, naming him as the headline speaker. Diane Okafor read each document. She read them fully. She did not skim. She did not glance. She read them the way a compliance officer reads documents, looking for what is there, not for what she had already decided would be there. Then she looked up at Forsyth. And she asked him one question. Just one. She said, "Before you requested this passenger's removal, did you review any of these documents?" Forsyth stood very straight. He said he had been acting on instinct and professional experience. He said his assessment of the situation had been based on his judgment as captain. He said he had the authority to make these calls without necessarily reviewing every piece of paper a passenger produced. Diane Okafor was quiet for a moment. The quality of that silence was very specific. It was the silence of someone who has received an answer that is somehow worse than the worst answer they anticipated. She asked Forsyth to wait by the cockpit. Diane turned to the girl. She spoke carefully, with the specific precision of someone who is not entirely certain how to address an 11-year-old in a situation that is unambiguously, structurally, her equal. She asked if the girl would be willing to share her recording. The girl looked at her for a moment. Then she said, clearly, evenly, without hostility, that she would be sharing the recording with airport security, the FAA complaint office, and her family's legal team simultaneously. She was not threatening. She was describing a sequence of events she had already planned, with the calm specificity of someone who has watched adults handle power long enough to understand what it looks like to handle it correctly. She also said she had one question. She asked whether the airline's non-discrimination policy covered disability status in addition to race, because what had occurred in the last 20 minutes appeared to involve both, and she wanted to understand the policy framework before the conversation about consequences began. Diane Okafor looked at her for a full second longer than she had looked at anyone else on the plane. Then she said, without any performance, "Yes. It does." The girl nodded. She asked whether she and Marcus could be permitted to continue their flight, undisturbed, either on this aircraft or on a rebooked first-class alternative at the airline's expense. She said she was asking not as a request but as a statement of what the appropriate resolution looked like, and she wanted to make sure everyone in the immediate area understood that she was making a record of this conversation. Diane said she would make it happen personally. She reached out and gently took the folder of Marcus's documents and walked back to the cockpit. What happened in that cockpit is not entirely known. The conversation between a regional VP of operations and a 28-year captain who had just refused to read a single document while removing a platinum elite passenger from his seat is not something that was recorded, or at least not something that has been made public. But the people sitting in first class heard the tenor of it, not the words, but the register. The shape of the exchange. One voice, measured and final. Another voice that started with authority and seemed to lose it as the minutes passed. And then it stopped. And then the cockpit door opened. Remember, the recording had been running since the beginning. Every second of what had happened in that cabin was on Zara's phone. There was no ambiguity in that footage. There was no angle from which it could be interpreted generously. The documents had been shown. The documents had been ignored. The word, safety, had been used in place of an argument. And the calmest, most credentialed, most prepared person on that plane had been the one being told he didn't belong. Daniel Forsyth did not fly that plane. He came out of the cockpit with his hat in his hand, literally his pilot's cap held at his side rather than on his head, which is a small detail but which every flight crew member who witnessed it understood immediately, and he walked down the first-class aisle toward the main cabin exit. He did not look at Marcus. He did not look at the girl. He did not look at the gate agents who were still standing near the front. He walked with the rigid, forward-facing pace of a man who is aware that every person in his field of peripheral vision is watching him and who has decided that the only dignity available to him now is in not breaking stride. He deplaned. The first-class cabin watched him go. Nobody spoke. The guitar player in 3A stared at his overhead bin. The couple in 3B held each other's hands without looking at each other. Sandra the flight attendant let out a slow, long breath that she had clearly been holding for the better part of 23 minutes. Diane Okafor came back through the cabin. She walked to Marcus. She picked up his phone from the armrest, where it had been recording, and typed on it, so that he could read every word. On behalf of this airline and as a representative of its leadership, I want to apologize to you personally for what you experienced on this aircraft today. It was not acceptable. It did not reflect our policy or our values. I am personally ensuring that this is fully documented and reviewed at the highest level. I am available to you by name and by direct line if you need anything going forward. She turned the phone and showed it to him. He read it. Then she asked, typed herself on the same phone, if he would like to be moved to a different seat. A different row. A different position in the cabin, away from where all of this had happened. He read it. He thought for a moment. Then he typed back one sentence. I would like to stay in the seat I paid for. Diane read it. She nodded once. She said, absolutely. A replacement captain, a woman as it happened, who came from the second aircraft parked at the adjacent gate with the efficient composure of someone pulled from a standby rotation, boarded the aircraft 18 minutes later. She introduced herself over the PA system. She said she was sorry for the delay. She did not explain the reason for it. She did not need to. Every person in first class already knew. The flight departed 43 minutes late. Marcus sat in seat 2A. He put his headphones back on. Not because there was anything to hear, but because the vibration reduction made the pressure equalization easier, and because the gesture of putting them on was, for him, the gesture of returning to his own interior. His own space. The life inside his own head that this confrontation had invaded and that he was now, with great deliberateness, reclaiming. He looked out the window as the ground fell away beneath them, Atlanta getting smaller. The grid of streets and the glint of the Chattahoochee and the sprawl of the city, he grew up in shrinking to abstraction the way cities always do from altitude, losing their complications, their histories, their specific weights, becoming simply pattern and light. He did not cry. He was not the kind of man who cried on planes. He was the kind of man who looked at windows and processed things with great thoroughness and very little visible evidence of the processing. He had been doing it since he was 19 years old. He was very good at it. It cost him things that nobody ever saw. In seat 2C, the girl opened her legal brief back to the middle section, the one she had been reading before all of this started, and picked up where she had left off. After 20 minutes at cruising altitude, Marcus tapped her on the arm. She looked up. He held out his phone. On the screen, one word. Thank you. She read it. She held his gaze for a moment, Just a moment, the length of something being recognized, and then she gave a small, single nod. Not a performance. Not a bow. The nod of a person who did what they did because it needed doing, and who considers the matter, functionally, closed. Then she went back to her brief. Neither of them opened social media. Neither of them posted anything. Neither of them told the story to anyone on that aircraft, or in the baggage claim, or in the rideshares that took them to their respective destinations in Los Angeles. But Sandra, the flight attendant, was in the back galley with her personal phone. And 218 other passengers had just landed at LAX with the same story and no instruction about what to do with it. By midnight, they would have their answer. A captain just deplaned in disgrace. A VP just apologized in writing. And neither Marcus nor the girl has posted a single word. But the internet doesn't wait for permission, and what happened next when 218 people told the same story at the same time is the reason you are still watching. Don't leave now. Subscribe if you haven't, because the viral moment is coming, and trust me, it hits differently than you think. When Diane Okafor offered Marcus a different seat and he said, "I'd like to stay in the seat I paid for," what did that moment mean to you? Tell us in the comments. Her name was Zara Adekunle Whitfield. She was 11 years old. She was born in London to a Nigerian father and an American mother, and she had been raised between three cities, Lagos, London, and New York, in the particular way that children of globally mobile, enormously successful families are raised, which is to say with a calibrated understanding of how different rooms work and what different kinds of power look like and what it costs to exercise it carelessly. Her father, Emmanuel Adekunle, had built Adekunle Ground Services from a single cargo handling contract at Lagos's Murtala Muhammad International Airport into a multinational aviation logistics company with operations at 17 airports across 3 continents. He had died 18 months prior, of a sudden cardiac event, at the age of 49. He had left his company in trust. He had left the majority share, 51%, to his daughter. Zara Adekunle Whitfield was, as of that morning, the youngest majority shareholder of an aviation logistics company that held active ground handling contracts at 6 American airports, including, as it happened, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International, including, specifically, a ground handling contract with the airline that had just tried to remove a decorated deaf black aerospace engineer from his first-class seat for the crime of existing in it. Zara had been traveling alone to Los Angeles for a meeting with the company's West Coast legal representative, a meeting that had been scheduled for months and that her mother, who ran the day-to-day operations as acting CEO, had trusted her to attend because Zara had attended every meeting she was old enough for and had been attending company board meetings since she was 7, first sitting quietly in the corner, then asking questions, then arguing positions with a clarity that made the company's lawyers start writing things down. She had not been looking for what happened on that plane. She had simply been on a plane, reading a legal brief, minding her own affairs, when a man in a uniform had decided that another passenger's black face and silent demeanor were sufficient cause to override his credentials, his documentation, and his dignity. And Zara had intervened because her father had taught her, not with a speech, but with the accumulated weight of everything she had watched him do, that the people who have resources and access and a room to stand in are responsible for how they use them when someone else is being wronged. He had not taught her this abstractly. He had taught her this by doing it, every time, in every room he ever occupied. She was his daughter. She did not know how to do it any other way. That evening, from her hotel room in Los Angeles, Zara posted the video. No caption. No music. No filter. No slow zoom or dramatic title card. No commentary or narration or framing. Just 4 minutes and 17 seconds of unedited footage, starting from the moment Forsyth tapped Marcus on the shoulder and ending with Diane Okafor typing her apology onto Marcus's phone, posted to her social accounts with nothing attached to it. Not even a period. By midnight, it had 800,000 views. By morning, it had passed 14 million. By the following evening, Daniel Forsyth's name, employer, and 28-year career history were in every comment section, every quote retweet, and every screenshot cluster in 3 languages. His LinkedIn profile received so much traffic it crashed twice. The airline's customer service lines were overwhelmed. Their social media mentions, typically running at a few hundred per day, reached 30,000 in a 6-hour window. Someone pulled the airline's publicly available disability accommodation policy and posted it alongside a timestamp from the video. Someone else found a 2019 study showing that deaf passengers were disproportionately flagged for behavioral concerns on commercial flights. A disability rights organization published a thread that went nearly as viral as the original clip, connecting Marcus's experience to 15 documented incidents over 5 years in which hearing-impaired travelers had been treated as non-compliant or unresponsive and asked to deplane. The phrase, "show me your documents," started trending. Not because anyone had said it, but because it was the invisible thread running through the entire video. The thread of a man producing his documentation, again and again, to a person who had already decided it didn't matter. The thread of proof offered and ignored. Of evidence dismissed not because it was insufficient but because the person with the authority had already made their decision and documentation was just an inconvenience in the way of executing it. Someone clipped the specific moment, 27 seconds long, of Zara standing in the aisle and saying, "I'd like you to know who I am." They posted it with no caption. That clip alone reached 4 million views by day 2 and sparked a separate, sprawling conversation about what it means to have the kind of resources that make institutions listen, and why those resources are distributed the way they are, and what it means that an 11-year-old girl with a logistics empire at her back was the mechanism through which a 44-year-old decorated engineer finally received an apology. By the end of the week, the airline had issued 2 statements. The first, 48 hours after the video, said Captain Forsyth had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The second, issued 12 hours after the first, said his employment had been terminated. The statement said the airline did not tolerate discrimination of any kind and was committed to the dignity and safety of every passenger. It was 11 sentences long. It did not name Marcus. It did not name Zara. It mentioned disability accommodation 3 times and used the word values 4 times. Marcus did not comment. Zara did not comment. The video kept running. What the internet wanted to talk about was the girl. The 11-year-old. The billionaire. The poise. The line about the ground handling contract. It was, as a story beat, genuinely extraordinary, the kind of narrative coincidence that feels engineered even when it isn't, the kind of justice that feels poetic even when it's structural. And it was real. It happened exactly the way the video showed it happening. But the thing that mattered, the thing that should not get lost in the poetry of the resolution, was Marcus. Was what he had been doing, quietly, for the 25 years before that Tuesday morning. Was the titanium briefcase and the labeled folders and the 60-second boarding video and the Platinum Elite card and the 200 previous flights on the same airline. Was the specific, daily, exhausting labor of a deaf black man in professional America who had learned that his existence would always be treated as provisional until he made it impossible to treat it that way, and who had done that work every single day and was still, on a Tuesday in November, sitting in a first-class seat with his documentation in his lap while a man in a uniform refused to read it. Studies consistently show that black travelers are subjected to additional screening and questioning at higher rates than their white counterparts. Deaf and hard-of-hearing passengers report being treated as unresponsive, confused, or non-compliant at a rate that significantly exceeds their proportion of the traveling population. For black deaf travelers, who sit at the intersection of both, the data is not abundant because the data is rarely collected, which is itself a kind of statement. There is a phrase for what Marcus had been doing his entire career. Some people call it the documentation tax. The invisible, uncompensated labor of collecting and maintaining proof that you are who you say you are, that you own what you say you own, that you belong where you say you belong. Not because the law requires it. Not because the airline requires it. But because experience has taught you that the institutional default, absent any other information, in the presence of a certain face, will be to question, to assume, to require justification that would never be required of someone who didn't share your demographic profile. Marcus carried the documentation not because he was paranoid. He carried it because he was right. Zara knew, without being told, that Marcus was right. She had grown up in a family that built an empire and then spent half its energy proving the empire existed. She had watched her father walk into rooms with his business card in his jacket pocket and his credentials prepared in advance of the questions that would inevitably come. She recognized the titanium briefcase and the labeled folders not as excessive caution but as fluency in a language that certain kinds of people are required to learn. She stood up in that aisle because she had the resources to make it count. But the reason she stood up, the thing her father had actually taught her, was simpler than resources. It was this: you don't need to be the person being wrong to understand that something is wrong. 14 million views in 12 hours. A captain's career over. A contract under review. And Marcus Webb still hasn't said a word publicly. Because some people don't need the internet's validation, they were right before the internet found out about it. 2 final minutes left in this story, and they are the 2 hardest ones. Subscribe if you haven't. And don't skip what comes next. It's the part everyone talks about least and means the most. Do you think viral justice is real justice? Or is it just the appearance of accountability? We want your honest take in the comments. 3 weeks after the video went viral, Daniel Forsyth posted a public apology. He had created a new account. His original social media had been deactivated within 48 hours of the video's release, presumably because the volume and nature of what was arriving in his mentions had made maintaining them untenable. The new account had a different profile photo. A softer one. He was not in uniform. The apology was 2 minutes and 40 seconds long. He spoke clearly. He looked into the camera. He said he had spent the past 3 weeks in reflection and had begun working with a professional facilitator on unconscious bias. He said he had never intended to discriminate against anyone. He said his actions had been driven by instincts he had carried for years that he now understood to be shaped by biases he had not been aware of. He said he was committed to doing the work. He said he was deeply sorry for the harm he had caused. It was carefully worded. Whoever helped him write it, and someone clearly helped him write it, was skilled. Every sentence was structured to acknowledge wrongdoing while simultaneously distributing it into the diffuse category of systemic bias rather than personal choice. Every sentence was designed to close a legal vulnerability while maintaining the appearance of genuine reflection. The word harm appeared 5 times. The phrase, "I was wrong," appeared once, at the end, briefly in a clause. He did not name Marcus. He did not name Zara. He referred, throughout, to the passenger and the situation. Marcus did not respond. Zara did not respond. Marcus's attorney, who had been retained within 72 hours of the video's release, at the recommendation of the disability rights organization that had amplified the story, issued a brief 1-paragraph statement saying that Marcus appreciated the public's support and was focused on his work. The statement did not mention Forsyth. It did not mention the apology. Because there are 2 things an apology posted under external pressure can be, and genuine contrition is only one of them. The other is damage control. And an apology that was filed on a new account, 3 weeks after the event, drafted with clear legal guidance, referencing unconscious bias as a framework that diffuses personal responsibility into systemic abstraction, that apology tells you something. Not nothing, but something specific. It tells you the shape of the regret available, and it is the shape of a man who is sorry about consequences, which is not the same as being sorry about the choice that produced them. Marcus did not need Forsyth's apology to know what had happened on that plane. He had known it while it was happening. He had the documentation. He had always had the documentation. 6 months later, Marcus Webb still flies. He still travels for consulting work. He still boards planes with a titanium briefcase and a platinum elite card and a notes application on his phone. He still takes his window seat, left side, when available. He still watches cities shrink beneath him at altitude with the particular quality of attention that belongs to a man who wanted, once, to be the one in the cockpit, and who has made something extraordinary from the version of the sky that was available to him instead. He still records his 60 seconds. But now he takes a photograph of his boarding pass before he scans it, not after, before. He logs the seat number and the flight number in a notes app before he sits down, as a time-stamped record. He screenshots every confirmation email the moment it arrives, rather than trusting the digital records to be retrievable in real time. He carries a second copy of his documentation, the NASA clearance, the insurance, the TSA pre-approval, in a smaller folder in his personal bag, separate from the briefcase, because he has learned that the moment of confrontation does not always give you time to open the main case. He has added 3 new steps to a routine that was already an act of daily vigilance. 3 new steps that cost him, collectively, perhaps 4 minutes per trip. 48 minutes per month, assuming he travels twice a week. 9.5 hours per year, in addition to the labor he was already doing, just to maintain the same level of documentation readiness he had on the day none of it was sufficient. He delivered his keynote in Los Angeles. Standing ovation. He stood at the podium and looked out at 500 aerospace professionals, and he talked about atmospheric data modeling for 48 minutes, and he was brilliant. The engineers in the room came up to him afterward with questions that he answered through his phone and in ASL and occasionally in the imperfect, clear, deliberate spoken words he uses when something matters enough to use them. He was exactly what the keynote invitation said he would be. He was the headline. The prototype component he was carrying that day, the one in the titanium briefcase that a 28-year pilot refused to look at the documentation for, has since been featured at 2 international aerospace exhibitions. It is referenced in a forthcoming paper in the Journal of Aerospace Engineering. It is doing exactly what Marcus designed it to do. On the flight home from Los Angeles, Marcus requested seat 2A. Specifically, the airline's concierge line, which he called from his car on the way to LAX, noted the request without comment and confirmed it within minutes. When he boarded, he settled into the window seat on the left side and placed his titanium case in the overhead bin and took his 60-second video and put his headphones on. As the plane reached cruising altitude and Atlanta came back into view below, the grid of streets and the river and the airport where all of this had started, looking, from here, exactly like it always had, Marcus thought about a girl who read legal briefs and sat in aisle seats and understood, before she was old enough to drive, that the point of power is to use it correctly when the moment comes. He thought about what she had done. Not the card. Not the recording. Not the contract. He thought about the moment she stood up, 4 feet 9, 11 years old, backpack on, and stepped into the aisle and said what needed to be said to the people who needed to hear it. He thought about how she hadn't waited to be asked. How she hadn't weighed the cost of involvement against the comfort of non-involvement. How she had simply seen a man being wronged and moved toward the wrong. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, an enormous thing, wrapped in a small person, on an ordinary Tuesday. And Marcus thought about all the ordinary Tuesdays before it. All the flights, all the documentation, all the quiet, practiced readiness that most people in his industry would never have to maintain. He thought about the belonging tax, the price, invisible to those who don't pay it, that comes with moving through the world in a body that institutions treat as inherently suspect. The price of always needing to prove what others are simply assumed to have. The price of being a first-class passenger who has to document being a first-class passenger. The price of being a decorated engineer at an aerospace conference who carries the proof of his credentials like a second carry-on, because experience has taught him that credentials, for some people, are not assumed, they are demanded. He had paid that price for 25 years. He would keep paying it. Not because he chose to. Not because it was fair. But because the alternative, lowering his guard, trusting the institution to extend the default good faith it extended to others, was a risk he could not afford, and the events of that Tuesday had confirmed, in the most public and documented way possible, that his assessment of that risk was correct. Here is what Daniel Forsyth saw when he walked out of that cockpit. He saw a black man in a first-class seat with an expensive case in the overhead bin who wasn't making eye contact and wasn't responding to verbal cues. He saw a demographic profile and a behavior pattern, and he ran them through a filter built from a lifetime of assumptions he had never examined, and the output of that filter said, "This doesn't fit. This needs to be questioned. This requires justification." He did not see Marcus Webb, aerospace engineer, NASA project contributor, Platinum Elite member, keynote speaker. He did not see 25 years of documented, credentialed, recognized excellence in a field that Forsyth's aircraft depended on. He did not see the labeled folders or the authorization letters or the quiet, practiced dignity of a man who had learned that preparation was the only armor available to him. He saw silence. He saw property. And he made an assumption from those three things that a full briefcase of documentation could not dislodge, because the documentation was never the issue. The issue was the assumption. And the assumption did not require evidence. It only required an opportunity. The evidence proved him wrong. The recording proved him wrong. The regional VP and the replacement captain and the terminated employment proved him wrong. The 14 million views and the trending phrase and the disability rights organization's thread all proved him wrong. But here is the truth that sits underneath all of that proof. The truth that Marcus knows and that everyone who looks like Marcus knows and that the rest of the world cycles through in trending moments and then sets down when the news cycle moves on. Being proved right does not undo being questioned. Being vindicated does not restore what was spent in the process of earning the vindication. The 4 minutes and 17 seconds of video are real. The apology, such as it was, is real. The fired captain and the viral clip and the comments section full of people who watched the footage and felt the appropriate outrage, all of it is real. And Marcus Webb is still taking photographs of his boarding pass before he scans it. Still logging the seat number before he sits down. Still adding steps to a routine that should never have needed to exist in the first place. Still doing the quiet, invisible, exhausting work of being a black deaf man in professional America who knows that the price of being undocumented is higher, for him, than it is for the man in seat 4A with the guitar. Prejudice does not need truth to operate. It does not need facts or evidence or a case built from demonstrable wrongdoing. It only needs an opportunity and an authority, a uniform, a title, a position at the front of a room through which to move. It finds the gaps in the documentation. It finds the moments of unguarded ordinariness. It finds the Tuesday morning when a man is reading slides and drinking coffee and has, for a single unguarded moment, stopped preparing for what he knows might come. And it taps you on the shoulder. What happened on that plane was not an anomaly. It was a Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that Marcus Webb and people who look like Marcus Webb and people who live in the particular intersection of race and disability that Marcus inhabits, the kind of Tuesday they have been having with and without cameras, with and without billionaire 11-year-olds in the aisle seat, for a very long time. The video made it visible. Visibility is not nothing. But it is also not everything. And the gap between what visibility produces and what justice actually requires is exactly the space where Marcus Webb still lives, where he still prepares, still documents, still records his 60 seconds, still carries his proof, long after the internet has moved on to the next story. Long after the trending hashtag has faded. Long after Forsyth posted his apology on his new account. Long after the cabin went silent at 37,000 feet, on a Tuesday in November, when a child stood up in the aisle and said what needed to be said, and an engineer sat in his window seat and was, for a moment, seen. He was always who he said he was. He always had the documentation to prove it. The proof should never have been necessary. That is the story of Marcus Webb and Zara Adekunle-Whitfield. And if you made it to the end, all 60 minutes, then you already know why these stories matter. They matter because they are true, and because the truth in them belongs to people who are still living it, long after the views stop climbing. Subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment, not just a reaction, but a real one. Because the conversation that should happen after a story like this is the one we don't stop having. What is the moment from this story that you will remember longest? And what does it say to you about the world we are living in? Tell us in the comments. We will read every word.